I stared at the charity donation receipt in my trembling hands. $50 million transferred to various organizations around the world. The number felt surreal, but the satisfaction coursing through my veins was absolutely real. Behind me, I could hear my stepmother's hysterical screaming as she discovered her bank accounts had been emptied, my stepsister's sobs as she realized her credit cards were maxed out, and my father's panicked phone calls to lawyers who would never take his case. They had no idea this was just the beginning. The memory of my previous death still burned fresh in my mind. The slow, agonizing poisoning they had orchestrated, the way they had smiled at my funeral while counting the inheritance money. But this time, I had been reborn with all my memories intact, and I had spent the last 23 years of this second life preparing for this exact moment. Let me take you back to how it all began, because the story of my revenge starts with understanding exactly what these monsters did to me in my first life. I was born Sarah Chen, the beloved daughter of tech mogul Richard Chen and his wife, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a brilliant pediatric surgeon. For the first 5 years of my life, I was the center of my parents' universe. My father would read me bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved kingdoms, while my mother taught me to paint watercolor flowers and speak 3 languages. But paradise ended the day my mother died in what the police called a tragic accident. A car crash on a rainy Tuesday morning as she drove to the hospital for an emergency surgery. I was 5 years old, standing in my pink pajamas at her funeral, when I first laid eyes on Victoria Manning and her daughter Emma. Victoria was everything my mother wasn't: cold where my mother had been warm, calculating where my mother had been genuine, beautiful in the sharp, predatory way of a knife blade. She approached my grief-stricken father at the wake, her hand gentle on his arm, her voice honey-sweet with practiced sympathy. "Richard, I'm so sorry for your loss," she murmured, her green eyes glistening with tears that looked real, until you noticed they never actually fell. "Elizabeth was such a wonderful woman. If there's anything Emma and I can do to help you and Sarah through this difficult time." Emma, 7 years old and already a master manipulator, knelt down to my level with a smile that made my skin crawl even then. "Don't be sad, Sarah. Mommy and I will take care of you now." I didn't know it at the time, but I was looking at my future murderers. Victoria's campaign to infiltrate our family was methodical and brilliant. She started slowly, bringing casseroles and offering to babysit while my father worked late hours to cope with his grief. She was always perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, the ideal widow's friend who just wanted to help. Emma would play with me during these visits, teaching me games that always seemed to end with me getting hurt or in trouble. "Sarah pushed me," Emma would cry, tears streaming down her face, even though she had clearly tripped herself. "She said mean things about my daddy." My father, drowning in his own grief and desperate for any kind of stability, began to see Victoria as a lifeline. She was organized where grief had made him scattered, calm where he was emotional, present where the demands of his business often pulled him away. Within 3 months of my mother's funeral, Victoria was essentially living in our house. Within 6 months, she and my father were married in a small private ceremony that I wasn't even allowed to attend. "Children shouldn't be at weddings," Victoria explained to my father with that gentle, reasonable tone that would become the soundtrack of my destruction. It might be too confusing for Sarah, given her recent loss. Perhaps it's better if she stays with the nanny. And just like that, I was erased from one of the most important moments of my father's life. The abuse began immediately after the honeymoon, but it was so subtle, so carefully orchestrated, that even now, with the benefit of hindsight and a second life's worth of experience, I can admire its cruel artistry. Victoria was never overtly cruel to me in front of my father. Instead, she used 1,000 tiny cuts, each one small enough to dismiss, but devastating in their cumulative effect. She started by redecorating our house, replacing every trace of my mother with her own aesthetic. My mother's paintings were quietly donated to charity. Her books disappeared from the shelves. Her garden was torn up and replaced with geometric hedges that required no care or love. Within a year, it was as if Elizabeth Chen had never existed. "We need to help Sarah move forward," Victoria would explain when my father questioned these changes. "Clinging to the past isn't healthy for a growing child. She needs to focus on her new family now." My own room wasn't spared. The soft pastels and whimsical decorations my mother and I had chosen together were replaced with stark white walls and furniture that looked more appropriate for a psychiatric facility than a child's bedroom. When I cried about losing my mother's paintings, Victoria sighed sadly and explained to my father that I was having attachment issues. The child psychologist I consulted said that removing triggers for her grief episodes would help her process her loss more effectively. She lied smoothly. There was no child psychologist, of course, but my father trusted his new wife's judgment completely. Emma's role in this psychological warfare was perfect. She was my peer, my supposed sister, and my constant tormentor. She would break my toys and claim I had done it in a tantrum. She would steal my homework and turn it in as her own, then express concern to teachers about my learning difficulties. She would invite friends over and encourage them to exclude me from games, then comfort me afterward with poisonous sympathy. "Don't worry, Sarah," she would whisper when I cried about being left out. "Some people just aren't meant to have friends. But I'll always be here for you." The psychological manipulation was reinforced by financial control. My mother had left me a substantial trust fund, nearly $10 million that was supposed to be mine when I turned 18. But Victoria quickly convinced my father that such a large sum would be harmful to my development. Money like that could spoil her, Victoria argued during a dinner conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. "Look at how entitled she's become already. Perhaps we should consider restructuring the trust, maybe reducing the amount or pushing back the distribution date. It would teach her the value of hard work." By the time I was 8, my trust fund had been restructured 3 times. The amount was reduced to $500,000, the distribution date pushed back to age 25, and Victoria had been named as one of the trustees with veto power over any withdrawals. Emma, meanwhile, received a new trust fund of her own, $2 million from my father's personal wealth, accessible at 18 with no restrictions. School became another battlefield. Victoria had me transferred from the prestigious private academy, where I had thrived, to a public school in a rougher district, claiming it would be good for my character development. Emma, of course, remained at the private school where she excelled in the smaller classes and individualized attention. "Sarah needs to learn resilience," Victoria explained to my father. "She's been coddled her entire life. A more challenging environment will help her develop the strength she'll need in the real world." The challenging environment nearly broke me. I went from being a confident, curious child to a withdrawn, anxious mess who jumped at shadows and flinched when adults raised their voices. My grades plummeted as I struggled to keep up in overcrowded classrooms with overworked teachers who had no time for a traumatized little girl. Victoria used each failing report card as evidence that I was academically limited and probably needed to adjust my expectations for the future. "Not everyone is cut out for higher education," she would say with false sadness. "Perhaps Sarah would be happier in a vocational program. There's nothing wrong with working with your hands." The physical abuse was more subtle but no less devastating. Victoria never hit me directly. That would leave evidence. Instead, she engineered situations where I would be hurt accidentally. She would leave obstacles in dark hallways that I would trip over. She would serve me food that was scalding hot and express concern when I burned my mouth. She would insist I help with household chores that were clearly beyond my capabilities, then act disappointed when I inevitably got injured. "Sarah is such a clumsy child," she would sigh to my father. "She's covered in bruises half the time. I worry that other people might get the wrong impression about her home life." The implication was clear. If anyone noticed my injuries and suspected abuse, it would be my own clumsiness and lies that had created the suspicion, not her actions. Emma's contribution to the physical torment was more direct. She would pinch and scratch me when adults weren't looking, then comfort me loudly when I cried. She would push me downstairs and claim I had tripped. She would hide thumbtacks in my shoes and express shock when I cried out in pain. "Sarah hurts herself for attention," she would explain to anyone who asked. "Mommy says it's because she misses her real mom so much. It's really sad." By the time I was 12, I had learned to be invisible. I spoke only when spoken to, kept my eyes down, and tried desperately not to give them any excuse for further punishment. But invisibility wasn't enough for Victoria and Emma. They needed complete destruction. The escalation began when my father's business started experiencing some difficulties. A few bad investments and a market downturn had reduced his net worth from $200 million to a still substantial $150 million. But Victoria saw this as a crisis that required immediate action. "We need to be more careful with our finances," she announced during a family meeting when I was 13. "Emma's education costs are increasing, and we have to think about her future. Perhaps it's time to consider reducing some of our other expenses." Those other expenses were anything related to me. My already meager allowance was eliminated entirely. My clothes budget was cut to almost nothing, forcing me to wear Emma's hand-me-downs even though they were often too small or inappropriate for my age. My school lunch money disappeared, and I began eating only breakfast and dinner, losing weight rapidly. "Sarah is becoming quite the little minimalist," Victoria would joke to her friends. "She's really learning to appreciate the simple things in life." Emma, meanwhile, received new clothes every season, a car for her 16th birthday, and permission to join expensive extracurricular activities. The contrast was stark and deliberate. She was the beloved daughter who deserved everything, while I was the burden who should be grateful for scraps. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their campaign. Victoria had systematically alienated me from my mother's family, claiming that their grief over Elizabeth's death was unhealthy for me to be around. My maternal grandparents, who had adored me and wanted to be part of my life, were told that I found their presence triggering and needed space to heal. The child psychologist recommends minimal contact with reminders of her trauma, Victoria explained in sympathetic phone calls I wasn't supposed to hear. "I know it's hard for you, but we have to think about what's best for Sarah's mental health." My mother's sister, Aunt Jennifer, who had tried to maintain a relationship with me, was gradually frozen out through a series of canceled visits and unreturned phone calls. When she finally confronted my father directly, Victoria was ready with documentation of my supposed psychological fragility. "Sarah has been having panic attacks after visits with Jennifer," she explained, showing my father a folder of fake medical reports and therapy notes. "The doctor thinks the resemblance to Elizabeth is too strong. It's re-traumatizing her every time they're together." One by one, every connection to my mother's world was severed, leaving me completely dependent on Victoria and Emma for any human contact. They used this isolation to reinforce their narrative about my defectiveness. If my own family couldn't stand to be around me, clearly there was something fundamentally wrong with me. High school brought new opportunities for torment. Victoria enrolled me in a different school than Emma, claiming it was a better fit for my learning style, but really ensuring that I couldn't benefit from any social connections Emma might have made. My new school was academically rigorous but socially brutal, full of wealthy students who immediately identified me as an outsider. My clothes were wrong, my social skills were non-existent after years of isolation, and I had no money for the activities and social events that might have helped me make friends. I ate lunch alone in the library and spent weekends in my room, reading books I borrowed from the school library because I couldn't afford to buy my own. Emma, of course, thrived at her school. She was popular, successful, and college-bound, with a full social calendar and a string of accomplishments that Victoria proudly displayed on the refrigerator. My own achievements, perfect grades despite my challenging circumstances, writing awards, volunteer work, were ignored or dismissed. "Academic success isn't everything," Victoria would say when teachers praised my work. "Social development is just as important, and Sarah clearly struggles in that area. Perhaps she should focus on more practical skills." The summer before my senior year, when I was 17, Victoria and Emma began planning what they called their final solution. They had decided that I was becoming too much of a burden, and that my father's obvious guilt about my treatment was interfering with their access to his wealth. It was time to eliminate me permanently. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would gradually poison me with heavy metals, mercury, lead, and arsenic, administered in small doses that would mimic the symptoms of a psychological breakdown. As my behavior became increasingly erratic due to neurological damage, they would present my father with evidence of my mental illness and convince him to have me institutionalized. "She's becoming dangerous," Victoria began, suggesting to my father, as the poisoning started taking effect. "Yesterday, I found her talking to herself in the garden, and last week she accused Emma of stealing from her. I'm worried she might hurt herself or someone else." The poisoning began slowly with tiny amounts of mercury added to my food. At first, I just felt tired and confused. My grades dropped slightly and I had trouble concentrating. Victoria expressed concern to my father about my declining performance, suggesting that I might be using drugs. I hate to say this, Richard, but we should consider drug testing, she said sadly. The signs are all there: mood swings, academic decline, paranoid behavior. And you know how easy it is for troubled teenagers to find drugs these days. When the drug test came back negative, Victoria wasn't deterred. She simply shifted the narrative to mental illness, claiming that my behavior was becoming increasingly concerning. She began documenting every minor mistake I made, every moment of confusion or fatigue caused by the poison in my system. She left the stove on again yesterday, Victoria would report to my father. And when I asked her about it, she insisted she hadn't been cooking. She seemed genuinely confused, as if she couldn't remember. I'm really worried about her mental state. As the poisoning continued, my symptoms worsened. I developed tremors in my hands that made writing difficult. My memory became spotty, and I would forget conversations or assignments. My coordination suffered, and I began falling downstairs or bumping into walls. Victoria documented every symptom, building a case for my mental incompetence. Emma's role was to provide corroborating testimony about my dangerous behavior. She claimed that I had threatened her, that I had stolen money from her purse, that I had tried to hurt the family pets. None of it was true, but combined with my obvious physical deterioration, it painted a picture of a seriously disturbed young woman. I'm scared of her, Emma would whisper to my father, her eyes wide with manufactured fear. She looks at me sometimes like she wants to hurt me. And the things she says, they don't make sense. She talks about people who aren't there and claims things that never happened. By the time I turned 18, I was so sick I could barely function. The mercury had damaged my nervous system, causing memory loss, coordination problems, and mood swings that Victoria gleefully documented as evidence of my mental illness. My father, genuinely concerned about my deteriorating condition, agreed to have me evaluated by a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist Victoria chose was Dr. Marcus Webb, a disgraced physician who had lost his license in another state and was working under a false identity. For the right price, he was willing to diagnose me with any condition Victoria specified. After a single 30-minute session where I could barely string together coherent sentences due to mercury poisoning, he declared me a danger to myself and others. Severe schizoaffective disorder with paranoid delusions, he announced to my father. She needs immediate institutionalization before she hurts someone. I can recommend an excellent facility that specializes in cases like this. The facility was a private psychiatric hospital known for its willingness to keep patients indefinitely as long as the bills were paid. The plan was to have me committed there while Victoria and Emma convinced my father to sign papers giving them power of attorney over my finances. Once I was locked away and declared mentally incompetent, they would have access to both my trust fund and my father's wealth. But they had underestimated how much my father still loved me, despite years of their manipulation. When Dr. Webb recommended immediate commitment, my father insisted on a second opinion from a legitimate psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins. Victoria tried to talk him out of it, but he was adamant. I need to be sure, he said firmly. This is my daughter we're talking about. I won't have her locked away without exploring every option. The appointment at Johns Hopkins was scheduled for the following week, but Victoria and Emma knew that a real doctor would immediately recognize the signs of heavy metal poisoning. They had to act quickly. The final attempt on my life came 3 days before the Johns Hopkins appointment. Emma made my favorite dinner, pasta carbonara, and added a massive dose of mercury to my portion. It was enough to kill me within hours, and my death would be attributed to a psychotic episode that led to accidental poisoning. She must have gotten into the garage chemicals, Victoria would explain to the police. We've been so worried about her mental state. This is exactly the kind of impulsive, dangerous behavior Dr. Webb warned us about. I ate the poisoned pasta without suspicion, trusting Emma despite everything she had done to me. Within an hour, I was violently ill. Within 3 hours, I was unconscious. Within 6 hours, I was dead, my body finally succumbing to years of systematic poisoning. I died alone in my childhood bedroom while Victoria and Emma sat downstairs discussing their inheritance plans, certain that they had finally eliminated the only obstacle to their complete control over my father's wealth. But somehow, impossibly, I opened my eyes in my 5-year-old body again, standing at my mother's funeral with perfect clarity about what was to come. The rebirth was jarring. One moment I was dying in agony, the next I was small and healthy again, watching Victoria approach my grieving father with predatory intent. This time, I would be ready. The first challenge was maintaining the facade of being a normal 5-year-old while possessing the memories and knowledge of an 18-year-old who had been murdered by her family. I had to be careful not to display knowledge or skills that would be impossible for a child my age, while also beginning the careful process of protecting myself and gathering evidence. I started with small things. When Victoria began her campaign to isolate me from my mother's family, I made sure to memorize their contact information and find ways to stay in touch secretly. I hid letters and pictures from my maternal grandparents and Aunt Jennifer, creating a paper trail that would prove their love for me and Victoria's deliberate interference. When Victoria suggested redecorating my room, I threw such a convincing tantrum about keeping my mother's paintings that my father overruled her for the first time. It was a small victory, but it established that I wasn't going to be as easy to manipulate this time around. Sarah seems very attached to these reminders of her mother, my father said firmly when Victoria suggested donating the paintings. I think we should let her keep them. She's been through enough trauma already. Victoria's smile was strained, but she nodded gracefully. Of course, Richard. We want what's best for Sarah. But I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was already planning how to get around this unexpected resistance. The second time around, I was also prepared for Emma's psychological warfare. When she tried to break my toys and blame me, I had already hidden the important ones and set up situations where her destructive behavior would be witnessed by adults. When she tried to steal my homework, I had already made copies and hidden them where she couldn't find them. Emma keeps trying to take my things, I told my father one evening, making sure to sound like a confused and hurt child rather than an angry teenager. She broke my dollhouse and said I did it, but I saw her do it. Why would she lie about that? My father was troubled by these reports, especially when they were corroborated by evidence. A hidden camera I had managed to install in my room, claiming it was a spy toy I wanted for Christmas, caught Emma red-handed, destroying my belongings and then lying about it to Victoria. I don't understand this behavior, my father said to Victoria after reviewing the footage. Emma is clearly lying about what happened. Why would she do that to Sarah? Victoria tried to explain it away as sibling rivalry, but the evidence was undeniable. For the first time, my father began to question whether his new wife and stepdaughter were as perfect as they seemed. But my real preparation was financial. I remembered every major business deal my father would make, every stock that would soar, every investment opportunity that would pay off. I also remembered the market crashes, the failed ventures, and the competitors who would try to undermine his business. At age 8, I convinced my father to set up a small trust fund for me, just $10,000 as a learning experience in financial responsibility. Victoria didn't object because the amount seemed insignificant compared to my original inheritance, which she was still working to control. What Victoria didn't know was that I used that $10,000 to make a series of carefully calculated investments based on my knowledge of the future. I bought stock in companies that were about to explode, invested in cryptocurrency years before it became mainstream, and purchased real estate in areas I knew would be gentrified. By age 12, that $10,000 had grown to $500,000. By age 16, it was $10 million. By age 21, it was $50 million. All of it hidden in offshore accounts and shell companies that Victoria and Emma knew nothing about. To them, I was still the same broken, worthless stepdaughter who couldn't even afford decent clothes. They had no idea that I was accumulating the resources I would need for my ultimate revenge. I also used my knowledge of their previous schemes to stay one step ahead of their manipulation. When Victoria tried to have me transferred to a worse school, I had already arranged for my teachers to document my excellent performance and recommend me for advanced programs. When she tried to isolate me from my mother's family, I had already established secret communication channels that she couldn't monitor. Most importantly, I began gathering evidence of their abuse and future plans. I recorded their private conversations, documented their systematic cruelty, and built a comprehensive case that would eventually destroy them both. The poisoning attempt came right on schedule during my senior year, but this time I was ready. I had been testing my food for months using a portable chemical analysis kit I had purchased online. When the mercury levels spiked, I immediately switched to eating only food I prepared myself or obtained from outside sources. Victoria and Emma were baffled when I didn't show the expected symptoms of heavy metal poisoning. They increased the doses, but I was no longer consuming their poisoned food. Instead, I was documenting their attempts to kill me and building a case for attempted murder. Sarah seems to be doing much better lately, my father commented one evening when I appeared perfectly healthy, despite their best efforts to poison me. Her grades are excellent, and her teachers say she's a joy to have in class. Victoria's forced smile couldn't hide her frustration. Yes, she's had some good days recently, though I still worry about her long-term stability. But their window for eliminating me was closing rapidly. I was about to turn 18, which would give me legal independence and access to my hidden fortune. More importantly, I was about to unleash the evidence I had been gathering for 13 years. The final confrontation came on my 18th birthday, exactly as it had in my previous life. Victoria and Emma had planned their intervention, complete with the fake psychiatrist and forged medical records, but this time I was ready with my own surprise. As they gathered in the living room to present their case for my involuntary commitment, I walked in with a team of FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and forensic accountants. Victoria Manning and Emma Manning, Agent Sarah Rodriguez announced, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, and racketeering." The look of shock on their faces was everything I had dreamed of for 13 years. Victoria's carefully controlled mask finally slipped, revealing the cold predator beneath. Emma broke down completely, sobbing and begging for mercy that would never come. "This is ridiculous," Victoria sputtered as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "Richard, you can't believe this nonsense. Sarah is clearly having another psychotic episode. She's delusional, dangerous. Yeah. Actually," I said quietly, "I'm the one who called the FBI. And I have 13 years worth of evidence to support every charge against you." The next few hours were a blur of Miranda rights, evidence collection, and crime scene photography. But the moment I had been waiting for came when Agent Rodriguez showed Victoria and Emma the scope of the evidence against them. 13 years of recorded conversations, documenting their plans to poison me, abuse me, and steal my inheritance. Financial records showing their systematic theft from both my trust fund and my father's accounts. Medical evidence proving their attempts to poison me with heavy metals. Testimony from other victims of Victoria's previous schemes. "You see," I explained as they sat in stunned silence, "I remembered everything from my previous life. Every lie you told, every crime you committed, every moment of cruelty you inflicted. And this time, I was ready for you." Victoria stared at me with pure hatred, her beautiful face twisted into something monstrous. "You little bitch! You planned this whole thing. You've been manipulating us for years." "I learned from the best," I replied calmly. "But unlike you, I used my manipulation skills to protect innocent people instead of destroying them." The trial was a media sensation that lasted 8 months. Victoria and Emma's lawyers tried every defense imaginable, claiming I had fabricated the evidence, that I was mentally ill, that the whole thing was an elaborate revenge fantasy. But the evidence was overwhelming, and more importantly, other victims began coming forward. Victoria's pattern became clear during the investigation. She had targeted 5 wealthy widowers over the past 20 years, marrying them and systematically destroying their relationships with their biological children while positioning Emma to inherit their wealth. 3 of her previous husbands had died under suspicious circumstances, with their children mysteriously developing mental health issues that led to their disinheritance. The prosecution presented evidence of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had stolen over $200 million from various families and was responsible for at least 7 deaths, including my murder in the previous timeline. Victoria was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emma received 40 years as an accomplice and co-conspirator. Both were ordered to pay restitution to their victims, money they didn't have because I had already donated their ill-gotten gains to charity. But my revenge didn't end with their imprisonment. I had spent years planning something far more comprehensive than simple justice. The $50 million I had accumulated through investments was just the beginning. Using my knowledge of future market trends, I continued building wealth throughout the trial and sentencing process. By the time Victoria and Emma were convicted, my net worth had grown to over $100 million. Every penny of it went to the Sarah Chen Foundation for Family Justice, a comprehensive organization dedicated to identifying and stopping family predators like Victoria and Emma. The foundation operates on multiple levels, funding legal aid for abused children, training social workers to recognize sophisticated abuse patterns, supporting research into family fraud schemes, and maintaining a database of known predators and their methods. But the foundation's most important work is proactive identification of potential victims. Using advanced data analysis and pattern recognition software, we monitor public records, social media, and financial transactions to identify families where children might be at risk from predatory step-parents or relatives. When we identify a potential threat, we deploy a team of investigators, social workers, and legal advocates to document the abuse and build cases for prosecution. In the 3 years since the foundation was established, we've prevented over 200 attempted murders, saved 1,500 children from systematic abuse, and secured convictions against 89 family predators. Victoria and Emma's conviction opened the floodgates for other victims to come forward. The foundation now maintains a victim support network that spans 12 countries and has helped recover over $500 million in stolen assets that have been returned to rightful heirs or donated to charitable causes. Every case we solve, every child we save, every predator we stop is funded by the money Victoria and Emma coveted so desperately. They spent years trying to steal my inheritance, not knowing that their crimes would eventually fund the creation of their worst nightmare, a well-funded, legally sophisticated network dedicated to destroying people exactly like them. The irony is perfect and intentional. They taught me that family could be a weapon, that love could be manipulated, that trust could be betrayed for profit. In response, I created an organization that uses those same insights to protect other families from experiencing what I experienced. Victoria writes to me sometimes from her maximum security prison cell. The letters are always the same, rage-filled screeds about how I ruined her life and destroyed her family. She seems genuinely unable to comprehend that her actions had consequences, that her victims deserved justice, that her crimes warranted punishment. Emma's letters are different, pleading, desperate attempts to convince me that she was just following her mother's orders, that she never wanted to hurt anyone, that she's learned from her mistakes and deserves a second chance. She seems to believe that if she shows enough remorse, I might somehow use my influence to reduce her sentence. I never respond to either of them, but I do visit them once a year, on the anniversary of my death in the previous timeline. Not to gloat or seek closure, but to remind them that their victims are real people with real lives that matter. During my last visit to Victoria, I brought photo albums filled with pictures of the children the foundation has saved. I showed her the faces of kids who are alive today because the money she tried to steal is being used to protect them. I told her about the families that have been reunited, the predators who have been stopped, the lives that have been rebuilt. This is what your greed accomplished, I told her calmly. Every dollar you coveted, every crime you committed, every life you destroyed, all of it led to this moment. You created the very weapon that destroyed you. Victoria stared at the photos with undisguised hatred, her hands clenched into fists behind the reinforced glass that separated us. You think you're so clever, she spat. You think you've won something, but you're just as sick as we are. This whole foundation, this obsession with revenge, it's not justice, it's pathology. Maybe, I acknowledged. But the difference is that my pathology saves lives while yours destroyed them. I can live with being sick if it means children don't have to die. The conversation ended there, but I could see in her eyes that she finally understood the scope of her defeat. She hadn't just failed to steal my inheritance. She had inadvertently funded the creation of an organization that would spend decades hunting down people exactly like her. Today, 5 years after their conviction, the foundation continues to grow and evolve. We've expanded into international operations, partnering with law enforcement agencies in 15 countries to track and prosecute family predators who operate across borders. We've developed new technologies for detecting financial fraud and abuse patterns, and We've trained thousands of professionals to recognize and respond to sophisticated manipulation schemes. My father, who has made a complete recovery from the stress and trauma of his marriage to Victoria, now serves as the foundation's chairman of the board. Working together to protect other families has healed the relationship that Victoria nearly destroyed. He tells me every day how proud he is of the woman I've become, how amazed he is by my strength and resilience. I should have protected you, he says sometimes, his voice heavy with regret. I should have seen what they were doing. You couldn't have known, I always reply. They were professionals. They had been perfecting their techniques for decades. The important thing is that we're stopping them now. But the sweetest part of my revenge isn't the money I've donated, or the predators I've stopped, or even the justice I've achieved. It's simpler and more profound than any of that. Victoria and Emma thought they could erase me, reduce me to nothing, steal my inheritance and my life without consequences. Instead, they created something far more powerful than the broken victim they intended to destroy. They created an enemy with unlimited resources, perfect knowledge of their weaknesses, and an unshakable commitment to ensuring that no other child suffers what I suffered. Every morning when I wake up in my beautiful home, surrounded by photos of the children the foundation has saved, I think about Victoria and Emma waking up in their concrete cells. They start each day knowing that somewhere in the world, the money they killed me for is being used to hunt down people exactly like them. They spent 18 years of my first life trying to break me, and 23 years of my second life thinking they had succeeded. They thought they were stealing from a helpless victim, accumulating wealth they could use to fund their luxury lifestyle. Instead, every dollar they coveted has become a weapon against predators like them. Every crime they committed has been transformed into evidence that protects other victims. Every moment of cruelty they inflicted has been converted into compassion for other suffering children. The Sarah Chen Foundation now operates with an annual budget of over $200 million, all of it generated by investments made with my knowledge of future market trends. We employ over 500 people worldwide, operate safe houses in 30 cities, and maintain legal partnerships with law enforcement agencies on 6 continents. But more than the scale of our operations, I'm proud of the culture we've built. Every employee of the foundation is someone who has been touched by family abuse or violence. Some are survivors like me, others are professionals who have dedicated their careers to protecting children. All of them understand that this work is personal, that every case we solve represents a real family whose lives we've saved. Last month, we prevented what would have been Victoria's exact scheme playing out in Stockholm. A recently widowed tech executive had married a woman who was systematically poisoning his teenage daughter while positioning her own son to inherit the family wealth. Our Swedish partners identified the pattern, gathered evidence, and made arrests before the daughter suffered permanent neurological damage. The daughter, Anna, reminds me so much of myself at that age. Brilliant, resilient, but deeply wounded by years of systematic abuse. The foundation is paying for her therapy, her education, and her legal fees as she rebuilds her relationship with her father. In 10 years, when she's ready, I hope she'll consider joining our team. Survivors make the best advocates for other victims. Stories like Anna's happen every month now, all over the world. Victoria and Emma's legacy isn't the wealth they tried to steal or the lives they destroyed. Their legacy is an organization that will spend decades undoing the damage caused by predators like them. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if they had never targeted my family. Would I have become a doctor like my mother? A business leader like my father? Would I have married, had children, lived a normal life focused on personal happiness rather than justice? I'll never know, and honestly, I've stopped mourning that alternate timeline. The woman I became through suffering and rebirth has a purpose that transcends personal fulfillment. Every child we save, every family we protect, every predator we stop justifies the pain I endured to get here. The Foundation's latest initiative is perhaps our most ambitious yet, a comprehensive early warning system that monitors public records, financial transactions, and social media patterns to identify potential family predators before they can complete their schemes. We call it the Guardian Protocol, and it represents the culmination of everything I learned from Victoria and Emma's methods. The system works by analyzing patterns that seem innocent individually, but become sinister when viewed collectively. A recent widower who suddenly changes his will shortly after remarrying. Children whose academic performance plummets after gaining a step-parent. Families where biological children are systematically excluded from financial decisions, while stepchildren gain increasing control. The Guardian Protocol identified the Stockholm case 3 months before the poisoning began, simply by analyzing the stepmother's financial behavior and cross-referencing it with similar patterns from Victoria's previous schemes. We were able to alert Swedish authorities, who began monitoring the family and intervened the moment the abuse escalated to attempted murder. But the system's most satisfying success came last year, when it identified a scheme eerily similar to what Victoria and Emma had planned for me. A woman named Patricia Hendricks had married a wealthy widower in Dallas and was systematically destroying his relationship with his daughter while positioning her own son to inherit everything. The parallels were uncanny. The daughter was being transferred to inferior schools, isolated from her mother's family, and gradually poisoned with small doses of arsenic. Patricia had even consulted with the same disgraced psychiatrist that Victoria had used, Dr. Marcus Webb, who was apparently still operating under various false identities. Our Dallas team moved quickly, installing surveillance equipment and gathering evidence of the abuse. Within 6 months, we had documented Patricia's entire scheme, including recorded conversations where she discussed her plans to have the daughter committed and her excitement about inheriting the father's $80 million estate. The arrest was particularly satisfying because it allowed us to finally capture Dr. Webb as well. He had been operating his fake psychiatry practice for over 15 years, helping predatory family members have their victims declared mentally incompetent. His patient files revealed connections to dozens of suspicious deaths and disappearances across multiple states. Patricia is now serving 25 years for attempted murder and conspiracy. Dr. Webb received life without parole for his role in multiple deaths, including mine in the previous timeline. The daughter, Rebecca, is thriving in college and has become one of our most effective advocates for other victims. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of our work came from an unexpected source: the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which now uses our research on family predator patterns to train federal agents. They've asked me to speak at their academy several times, sharing insights about how sophisticated these schemes can be and how difficult they are to detect without proper training. What you've created here goes beyond justice, FBI Deputy Director Maria Santos told me after my last presentation. You've turned your trauma into a systematic solution that's saving lives every day. The patterns you've identified, the intervention protocols you've developed, this is groundbreaking work in criminal psychology. The recognition from law enforcement has opened new doors for the Foundation. We now work directly with Interpol to track international family fraud rings, and our database of predator patterns has become the global standard for identifying and prosecuting these crimes. But the work that gives me the most personal satisfaction is our direct victim services program. We maintain safe houses in 30 cities where children can stay while their cases are being prosecuted. We provide therapy, education, legal advocacy, and long-term support to help survivors rebuild their lives. The safe houses are designed to be the opposite of everything Victoria and Emma inflicted on me. Warm, welcoming spaces where children are valued and protected. Each house has art therapy rooms, libraries, computer labs, and gardens where kids can plant flowers and watch them grow. We want every child who stays with us to understand that they are worthy of love, care, and investment in their future. Many of our residents eventually join the Foundation staff when they're older. Marcus, who survived a poisoning scheme in Phoenix, now runs our southwestern operations. Sarah, we have a lot of Sarahs, escaped a forced institutionalization plot in Miami and now heads our legal advocacy team. David survived systematic financial abuse by his stepmother and now manages our forensic accounting division. These survivor advocates understand the psychological warfare that family predators employ because they've lived through it themselves. They can spot manipulation tactics that might fool even trained professionals, and they have the credibility with victims that comes from shared experience. Nobody believed me when I tried to tell them what my stepfather was doing, Marcus told a group of new staff members during orientation last month. The Foundation was the first place where people understood that family abuse can be sophisticated, that predators can be charming and convincing, that victims aren't always perfect or sympathetic. We're not just saving these kids' lives, we're validating their reality. The Foundation's research division has also made significant contributions to understanding family predator psychology. Our longitudinal study of over 500 cases has identified common patterns that law enforcement agencies now use for training and investigation. We've found that family predators typically target recently widowed or divorced parents who are emotionally vulnerable and socially isolated. They use a combination of love bombing, gaslighting, and triangulation to gain control over the family system. They systematically destroy the target parent's relationship with their biological children while positioning themselves and their own children as the real family. The financial abuse usually begins within the first year of the relationship, with subtle changes to wills, trust funds, and business partnerships. The physical abuse often starts much later, after the predator has established complete psychological control and isolated their victims from potential allies. Most chillingly, we've documented that these predators often work in loose networks, sharing information about wealthy targets and successful manipulation techniques. They study each other's methods and refine their approaches based on what has worked in previous schemes. Victoria and Emma were part of one such network, operating primarily on the West Coast and targeting technology executives and entrepreneurs. Through our investigation, we've identified 17 other predator partnerships that used similar methods to steal from over 200 families. The network's recruitment process was particularly sophisticated. They identified potential targets through social media monitoring, obituaries, and divorce records. They researched each target's financial situation, family dynamics, and psychological vulnerabilities before making contact. They even conducted background checks on the target's children to identify which ones would be easiest to eliminate or manipulate. Breaking up this network required international cooperation between law enforcement agencies in the US, Canada, and the UK. The final arrests were coordinated across 3 time zones and resulted in 31 felony convictions. The recovered assets totaled over $400 million, most of which was returned to rightful heirs or donated to victim services. The network's downfall began with Victoria and Emma's conviction, which provided investigators with their first comprehensive look at how these schemes operate. The evidence I had gathered over 13 years of careful documentation became the foundation for understanding and prosecuting the entire criminal enterprise. "Your case broke this thing wide open," Detective Rodriguez told me after the final arrests were made. "Without your evidence and the patterns you identified, we never would have understood the scope of what we were dealing with. These people destroyed hundreds of families over decades, and they would have kept going if you hadn't stopped them." The psychological impact of bringing down an entire criminal network has been profound for the Foundation's survivor community. Many of our advocates were victims of predators connected to Victoria's network, and seeing their abusers finally face justice has provided a sense of closure that individual prosecutions couldn't achieve. "For years, I thought my stepmother was just a uniquely evil person," said Jennifer, who survived a poisoning attempt in Seattle. Understanding that she was part of a larger criminal organization actually makes it easier to process. It wasn't personal, it was just business to them. That somehow makes it less devastating. The Foundation now tracks 7 other suspected predator networks operating in different regions and targeting different types of families. Our investigators work closely with law enforcement to gather evidence and build cases that will hopefully result in similar coordinated takedowns. But beyond the criminal justice aspects of our work, the Foundation has also become a center for research into family healing and recovery. Our therapy programs have developed new approaches for helping victims rebuild their sense of self-worth and learn to trust again after systematic betrayal by family members. The betrayal trauma that results from family abuse is particularly complex because it involves people who are supposed to provide safety and protection. Traditional therapy approaches often fall short because they don't account for the sophisticated manipulation techniques that family predators employ. Our therapeutic model focuses on helping survivors understand that their responses to abuse were rational and adaptive, not signs of weakness or mental illness. We help them recognize the specific techniques their abusers used and understand how those techniques affected their behavior and decision-making. "You weren't broken," our therapists tell new clients. "You were responding normally to an abnormal situation. The confusion, the self-doubt, the inability to trust your own perceptions. These were all natural reactions to systematic psychological manipulation." The healing work is slow and difficult, but the results are remarkable. Survivors who come to us broken and isolated gradually rebuild their confidence, their relationships, and their sense of purpose. Many go on to successful careers, healthy relationships, and meaningful contributions to their communities. Some choose to work with the foundation, but we never pressure survivors to stay involved in anti-abuse work if it's not healing for them. The goal is to help people reclaim their lives and pursue whatever brings them joy and fulfillment, whether that's activism, art, business, family, or anything else. My own healing has been intertwined with building the foundation, but I recognize that not everyone processes trauma through advocacy work. Some survivors need to focus entirely on their personal recovery and building new positive experiences. We support whatever path leads to health and happiness. The Foundation's educational programs have also had significant impact on prevention. We provide training to teachers, social workers, healthcare providers, and other professionals who work with children about how to recognize signs of sophisticated family abuse. Many of the warning signs are counterintuitive because skilled predators are excellent at maintaining appearances of being loving, concerned family members. The children they abuse often present as difficult or troubled rather than as obvious victims, because the abuse is designed to make them appear mentally unstable or behaviorally problematic. Our training helps professionals look beyond surface presentations to identify patterns that suggest systematic manipulation. A child whose academic performance suddenly declines after a parent remarries. A teenager who becomes increasingly isolated from extended family members who previously had close relationships with them. A young person who develops mysterious health problems that doctors can't diagnose. These signs don't automatically indicate abuse, but they suggest the need for careful investigation and support. Too often, professionals assume that family problems are straightforward, that difficult children come from broken homes, that struggling students aren't getting enough support, that behavioral problems indicate mental health issues. The reality is often more complex. Some of the most dangerous family situations present as stable and supportive on the surface, while the actual nurturing families might appear chaotic to outside observers who don't understand the full context. Our training programs have reached over 10,000 professionals in the past 3 years, and we're already seeing results. Teachers are identifying concerning patterns earlier and making more thoughtful referrals to Child Protective Services. Social workers are asking better questions and looking more carefully at family dynamics. Healthcare providers are considering psychological causes for unexplained physical symptoms. The ripple effects of this training extend far beyond the families we directly serve. Every professional who learns to recognize sophisticated abuse patterns becomes a potential advocate for future victims. Every case that gets identified early is a family that might be saved from years of trauma. But perhaps the most important aspect of our prevention work is changing public understanding of what family abuse actually looks like. The popular image of an abusive family is often very different from the reality of sophisticated predator schemes. People imagine abuse as obviously violent, performed by clearly disturbed individuals who are easy to identify and avoid. They don't expect abusers to be charming, successful, well-respected members of the community who are skilled at manipulation and impression management. This misconception makes it easier for predators to operate and harder for victims to get help. When Victoria was systematically destroying my life, most people who knew our family saw her as a devoted stepmother who was struggling to help a troubled child. The idea that she was actually orchestrating the problems she claimed to be solving was almost unthinkable. Our public education campaigns work to expand understanding of how abuse actually operates. We share stories of survivors, explain manipulation techniques, and help people understand that victims often don't present as sympathetic or obviously innocent. The response to these campaigns has been overwhelmingly positive, but also sometimes challenging. Some people resist the idea that abuse can be so sophisticated or that predators can be so skilled at deception. They prefer the simpler narrative where victims are obviously innocent and abusers are obviously evil. It's too complicated, one critic told me after a speaking engagement. If we start assuming that every step-parent might be a predator, we'll destroy innocent families. Sometimes kids really are just difficult, and sometimes second marriages really are about love. I understand the concern, but I also know that this attitude enables predators to continue operating. The goal isn't to make people suspicious of every blended family, but to help them recognize genuine warning signs and respond appropriately when they see them. We're not asking people to assume the worst about every family, I explained to the critic. We're asking them to pay attention to patterns that suggest systematic harm. There's a difference between a difficult adjustment period and deliberate abuse designed to isolate and destroy children. The Foundation's work has also led to significant legal reforms in several states. Our research on family predator patterns has informed new legislation that makes it harder for step-parents to isolate children from their extended families and more difficult to use psychiatric commitment as a tool of abuse. The Sarah's Law package, passed in California, Oregon, and Washington, requires court approval for any changes to a minor's trust fund or inheritance if the changes occur within 5 years of a parent's remarriage. It also mandates second opinions for psychiatric evaluations that recommend involuntary commitment for minors and requires courts to consider evidence of family conflict when evaluating these recommendations. Similar legislation is being considered in 12 other states, and we're working with legislators to develop federal protections that would apply nationwide. The legal reforms won't prevent all family abuse, but they'll make it much harder for predators to use the systems that are supposed to protect children as weapons against them. The political process has been educational for me in ways I didn't expect. I assumed that protecting children from abuse would be a universally supported cause, but I've learned that even obvious reforms can become controversial when they intersect with other political priorities. Some opposition comes from libertarians who resist any new government oversight of family decisions. Some comes from mental health advocates who worry that requiring second opinions for psychiatric commitment will make it harder to help genuinely mentally ill children. Some comes from estate planning attorneys who argue that restricting trust fund modifications will interfere with legitimate family financial planning. Each concern has some validity, and crafting effective legislation requires balancing competing interests and priorities. The process has taught me patience and compromise, skills that weren't necessary when I was focused purely on justice and revenge. Legal reform is like therapy, one of our legislative advocates explained to me. It's slow, it's frustrating, and progress often feels invisible. But small changes accumulate over time, and eventually they create meaningful protection for people who need it. The Foundation's international work has been particularly rewarding because it's shown me that the problems we're addressing exist everywhere, but so does the capacity for healing and justice. Every culture has predators who target vulnerable families, and every culture has people who are willing to fight back against them. Our partnerships in other countries have taught me new approaches to prevention and intervention. Nordic countries have much stronger social safety nets that make it harder for predators to isolate their victims. Some Asian countries have extended family structures that provide more oversight of parental decisions. Latin American countries often have community-based support systems that can intervene when families are in crisis. But every system also has vulnerabilities that sophisticated predators learn to exploit. Wealthy predators can circumvent social safety nets by moving their victims to private schools and exclusive communities. They can manipulate extended family members by providing false information about their victims' behavior. They can co-opt community leaders by presenting themselves as concerned parents dealing with difficult children. The universality of these challenges has convinced me that the Foundation's work needs to be global in scope. Predators don't respect national boundaries, and neither should the systems designed to stop them. Our newest initiative is a global database that tracks known family predators and their associates across international boundaries. When someone like Victoria tries to target a new family, investigators anywhere in the world will be able to access information about their previous schemes and methods. The database has already prevented several international schemes where predators were moving between countries to avoid prosecution. Last month, we identified a man who had been systematically abusing stepchildren in the US, Canada, and the UK over a 15-year period. He was finally arrested in Australia before he could complete his scheme against a new family there. Building international cooperation for this work requires navigating complex legal and cultural differences. But the fundamental goal is simple: ensuring that predators can't escape justice by crossing borders and that victims can access help regardless of where they are. The personal cost of this work has been significant but worthwhile. I've spent the last 8 years focused almost entirely on the Foundation and its mission. I haven't had time for romantic relationships, extensive travel, or many of the experiences that people my age typically pursue. Sometimes I wonder if Victoria and Emma succeeded in destroying my capacity for normal happiness, even though I defeated their specific schemes. My life is meaningful and impactful, but it's also shaped entirely by the trauma they inflicted and my response to it. You've built something remarkable, my therapist told me during one of our sessions. But I sometimes worry that you've made yourself into a monument to your own suffering. There's more to healing than helping other people heal. She's probably right, but I'm not ready to step back from this work yet. There are still too many predators operating, too many children at risk, too many families being destroyed by people like Victoria and Emma. The foundation is strong enough now to operate without my day-to-day involvement, but the mission still feels urgent and personal. Maybe in a few years, when we've built even stronger systems and trained more advocates, I'll be able to focus more on my own life and relationships. Maybe I'll travel, write a book, start a family of my own. Maybe I'll discover interests and passions that aren't connected to trauma and justice. But for now, every morning when I wake up and check the Foundation's case reports, I'm reminded that somewhere in the world, a child is experiencing what I experienced. Somewhere, a predator is targeting a vulnerable family. Somewhere, a victim is dying alone while their abusers count their anticipated inheritance. And every day that we identify one of these situations, intervene effectively, and stop a predator from completing their scheme, Victoria and Emma's legacy becomes a little more clear. They thought they were destroying one inconvenient child to steal a relatively modest inheritance. Instead, they created an organization that has saved hundreds of children and recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen assets. The money they killed me for has been transformed into the largest anti-family abuse organization in the world. The manipulation techniques they perfected have become the basis for training programs that protect other victims. The trauma they inflicted has become the foundation for healing systems that help survivors rebuild their lives. They wanted to erase me from existence, to make it as if I had never been born. Instead, they ensured that my impact on the world would be permanent and far-reaching. Every child we save, every predator we stop, every family we protect is a testament to the fact that their cruelty ultimately served justice rather than evil. Victoria will spend the rest of her life in prison, but her real punishment is knowing that her crimes created the very force that destroyed her and continues to hunt down people like her. Emma will be released eventually, but she'll spend the rest of her life being monitored by the organization she helped create through her participation in my murder. They wanted to build a legacy of wealth and power stolen from their victims. Instead, they built a legacy of protection and justice for all the victims who came after me. And every night when I fall asleep in my comfortable bed, surrounded by photos of children whose lives we've saved, I know that somewhere in concrete cells, Victoria and Emma are lying awake, thinking about the money they lost, the freedom they destroyed, and the organization that will continue their punishment long after they're gone. That knowledge doesn't undo the trauma they inflicted or restore the innocence they stole from me. But it transforms that trauma into something powerful and purposeful, something that protects other children from experiencing what I experienced. In the end, that transformation is the most complete revenge I could have imagined. They tried to reduce me to nothing, and instead they helped me become everything I needed to be to stop them and everyone like them. The girl they murdered became the woman who destroyed them. The inheritance they stole became the foundation of their destruction. The family they corrupted became the model for healing that we share with other families. Victoria and Emma taught me that family could be a weapon, that love could be perverted into a tool for destruction, that the people who are supposed to protect you can become your greatest enemies. In response, I built something that proves the opposite, that family can be chosen and created, that love can be transformative and healing, that people who have been hurt can become protectors for others who are suffering. The Sarah Chen Foundation for Family Justice stands as proof that their cruelty was not the final word in my story. It was just the prologue to something much larger, much more meaningful, and much more powerful than anything they could have imagined. And every day that we continue our work, their defeat becomes more complete, more permanent, and more purposeful. They thought they were writing my ending. Instead, they gave me the perfect beginning.